Welcome to another episode of Eric Wade Whiskey Studies, and we're continuing our study of the history of Scotch whiskey. In this video, we're going to be looking at the ascendancy of Speyside. So basically, Speyside really coming on to the map. So I've been doing Islay single malts thus far during this study. However, since we're going to be looking at Speyside, I thought I should have a whiskey from Speyside. This is the Cragganmore 12-year-old Speyside single malt whiskey. It's bottled only at 40% alcohol by volume. I visited Cragganmore in June 2018, and it was going under renovations at the time. So I wasn't really thrilled with the aesthetics of the distillery. I thought it really needs some serious upgrades. And I wasn't real thrilled with the whiskeys that well. They were okay, but I wasn't real thrilled with them. However, I later bought this bottle. It's not too expensive, really affordable. And I was actually more impressed with this 12-year-old at home than I was at the distillery. Don't know why. Now, it's only 40% alcohol by volume, and we whiskey snobs tend to stick our nose up at it. But I have found that even though it's only at 40% ABV, it has a lot of fruit. It has a lot of complexity. It's a really nice whiskey. Now I know, of course, most of us go, yeah, but it would be so much better at 43 or 46 or even cask strength. You know what? You got to have a whiskey for everyone in terms of a style, even an ABV level. This is one that I would recommend for someone just getting into whiskeys. You know, if you're a beer drinker and you're a wine drinker, you're accustomed to much lower alcohol. If you're just starting to get to know whiskeys, this is a good place to start, because at 40%, it's going to seem really high to a wine drinker or beer drinker, and it is intensely flavored, concentrated in flavors if you're not accustomed to drinking whiskey, right? We become sort of deaf to some notes, because if we're drinking high-end, high ABV whiskeys all the time, we sort of lose our sensitivity to the sort of more delicate characters. So this is one that I actually really like. All right, let's get into our notes. With blended Scotch booming, it was necessary to expand existing malt distilleries and build new ones to meet the growing demand for spirit. And the last 2 decades of the 19th century saw significant growth in the creation of distilleries across Scotland. Particularly favored was the area of production known today as Speyside. Now, you may remember from previous videos, the area, generally speaking, was referred to as Glenlivet. And now it's being referred to as Speyside. And also, originally, it was just sort of under the umbrella of, it's still part of the Highlands, but it didn't have its own sort of unique identity at the time. So Speyside occupies a varying terrain between the cities of Inverness and Aberdeen, embracing the rivers of Deveron in the east and the Findhorn in the west, together with others such as the Livet and the Fiddick, which are intimately connected with the area's distilling heritage. Speyside gradually developed into one of Scotland's principal malt whiskey distilling centres, along with Campbellton and the Kintyre Peninsula of Argyllshire. Real nice layers of pear, apple, citrus, a little bit of cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg. It's sort of like a lighter apple pie character. Real nice whiskey. Now, if you're going to Scotland and you're going to visit distilleries, you go up to Speyside and you could sort of find a hotel to stay in, or motel, or bed and breakfast, and make that sort of your center, and then visit a lot of distilleries in the area, because in Speyside, there's sort of much more neighbor to neighbor. They're all compacted in an area. So you can visit a lot of distilleries in a local area when you're up there in Speyside. The whiskies from Speyside were on the whole lighter in character than the heavier, more peaty Campbellton malts. Overall, output of whiskey in Scotland rose from 41,095 litres of alcohol to a remarkable 92,820 litres in 1899. While the number of operational distilleries grew from 129 to 161 during the same period. So there were more distilleries at that time than there are now. Last count, there are somewhere around 128 to 130 distilleries in Scotland, but we're seeing a huge boom. So we're going to see another maybe dozen or so distilleries open up within the next couple of years. Moss and Hume of the Making of Scotch Whisky note that the balance of preference among promoters of new distillery projects, many of whom were blenders, was by that time beginning to shift to Speyside, or as they were termed, the time Glenlivet, and island whiskies, which could cover a high proportion of grain whiskey, sometimes as much as 95% in the blend. Gradually, the Campbellton and Islay malts, with their pungent flavors, became less popular with blenders, for whom the more restrained yet still characterful Speyside whiskies perfectly suited the developing taste among consumers for blended whiskies that were smooth and mellow. So that's another challenge, is a change in taste. And there are a gazillion things that can affect what common people or the average consumer is preferring. Right now, peated whiskeys are really, really popular. I love peated whiskeys. There are a lot of us peat heads out there. Islay is doing really, really well right now. However, taste can change, and you never know what is going to be the effect. If there's a real popular movie, right, a certain whiskey or a wine shows up in the movie, next thing you know, that whiskey or that wine becomes really, really popular and people are buying it. Consumers can be fickle, so you never know what's going to change. And so that another thing that distilleries need to be aware of is not only world events and the changing in markets, but also consumer trends based on what's going on in popular media. Speyside boasted a pool of local expertise that facilitated distillery design, construction, equipment, and operation. At its heart was the leading architecture firm C.C. Doig of Elgin, headed by doyen of distillery designers Charles Tree Doig. The prolific Doig was best known for producing the revolutionary Chinese-style pagoda head, properly known as a Doig ventilator. Previously, the roofs of distillery maltings had been equipped with revolving conical cowls, which facilitated the removal of smoke from the kiln below, but were aesthetically unappealing. Doig's new design was a kiln chimney which attracted air from all directions to provide a better draw for the fire beneath. It also had the advantage of being considerably more attractive. Doig's innovation was born at a site meeting at Dalwhinnie Distillery, a mile from Aberlour, on May 3, 1889, and subsequently became a trademark of distilleries throughout Scotland and beyond. The funny thing is now that a lot of distilleries aren't doing their own malting, so they have no malting floor, so they have no kilns, and thus they don't need a Doig ventilator. And yet now, this architectural interest has become so equated with distilleries. There are now distilleries in Scotland that have Doig ventilators that aren't really in use. They're just there for the look. They're just there in order to look like a Scotland distillery, which is a funny thing because, as noted, it really has an Asian design rather than a Scottish design. But it's just interesting how sort of this adaptation of an Asian style architecture to meet Scottish demand. But on the flip side, in Japan, around this time, and I'm not going to go into this, but at the same time, Japan is now starting to produce whiskey, or soon produce whiskey, and one of its founders of this Japanese whiskey industry going over to Scotland, learning about Scotch whiskey, even marrying a Scottish woman, bringing her back to Japan to start the Japanese whiskey industry. So Scotland has borrowed a little bit from Asia, and then Asia is going to borrow a little bit from Scotland. Speyside was an ideal area for whiskey making due to the availability of reliable and pure water sources, along with an abundance of locally grown barley and deposits of peat. Now, you may think, peat, isn't that what they do on the islands, up in Orkney and on Islay? No, there is a lot of peat in the Highlands and in Speyside. However, it doesn't have the same briny character, and typically you're not going to get the smokiness either. However, I have found sometimes could be as little as 2-3 ppms in a Highland peat or Speyside peat. You don't really notice it, but it does bring a sort of honeyed character to it, and there is a slight hint of heather because peat is made up of heather versus, seaweed and so forth that would make its way into the peat of, say, Islay and the other islands. However, the factor that most influenced the great burst of distillery development during the later 19th century was the arrival of the railway network in the northeast of Scotland, with the Strathspey Railway line from Boat of Garton near Avonmore to Craigellachie and Dufftown opening in 1863. Now let's take another wee sip. So the development of other technologies indirectly related to Scotch whiskey are another big part of its promotion. Essentially, if you really think about it, the internet today is the railway of that time. Now, obviously, you can't transport whiskey through the internet, but in terms of promotion, information, sales, and all that, the internet is the railway of the modern day in terms of promoting Scotch whiskey. This facilitated the import of fresh cask and coal and the export of cask filled with whiskey to the blending centers of Glasgow, Perth, and Leith, coinciding with the growing popularity of blended Scotch whiskey around the world. Cragganmore in the parish of Ballindock was established in 1869 and was the first distillery in Speyside to be purposely constructed close to a railway line. Cragganmore's founder, John Smith, had a private siding constructed to facilitate use of the neighboring line and was a great advocate of this rapidly developing form of transport. In 1887, 1 year after John Smith's death, the first whiskey special train left Ballindock Station with a load of no less than 16,000 gallons, or 72,737 liters of whiskey. By the time that first whiskey train departed Ballindock Station, former Mortlach Distillery manager William Grant had constructed his Glenfiddich distillery, with the first spirit flowing on Christmas Day of that year. And other distilleries to be founded during those heady years, which still survive today, include Grant's second distillery of Balvenie, Craigellachie, Altmore, Glendullan, Benromick, Tamdhu, Knockandhu, Longmorn, Benriach, Glenelgin, and Speybird. In total, of 33 distilleries that opened in Scotland during the last decade of the 19th century, no fewer than 21 were on Speyside, while others, such as Tomatin and Inverness, made what it termed Speyside-style whiskey. The increasing demand for blended Scotch whiskey was fueled to a significant extent by exports, with Australia, New Zealand, and India being major export markets, with North America following. The East Indies, West Indies, and Africa, not to mention South America and even Japan, were other areas where Scotch sold well. Australia was undoubtedly the largest export destination of the area, with John Walker and Sons opening an office in Sydney during 1887. During the 1890s, the blending industry came to be dominated by John Walker and Sons, John DeWar and Sons, and James Buchanan and Company, collectively known as the Big Three. All increased profits dramatically during this golden age of blending. It would be wrong to give the impression that single malt whiskeys were completely eclipsed by blends. Dalmore, for example, did a large trade into its own whiskey worldwide. Andrew Mackenzie of Dalmore wrote, "Once one gets initiated to pure Highland malt or self whiskey that is the product of one distillery, it is invariably preferred to the best of blends, but it requires a little education at first with people who have never taken it before. Much self whiskey, particularly for the export market, was matured for about 5 years. It found a ready market at Christmas time among the sporting fraternity who visited Scotland for fishing and shooting and enjoyed the local tipple during their stay. They would order cases of it to be delivered by rail. There were exhibitions of self whiskies from different malt distilleries in Scotland and elsewhere, with medals for those to be judged best." So that's a term I haven't really heard much. Is we think of single malts is something being called self whiskey. I haven't seen that in too many sources, but apparently it was a term of the day, one that's sort of fallen out of popularity today. So if you hear the term self whiskey, it's referring to a single malt. Now, people had become accustomed to blends, a consistent house style. However, once people began to taste single malts, they found something unique about them. And so single malts would then begin to boom and become much more popular. Alrighty, but still today, blends still make up 90% of the market. All right, that's it for this review, for this study of the history of Scotch whiskey. If you have subscribed to this channel, I really want to thank you. If you haven't yet subscribed but you like watching my videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I go live or when I post a new video. And until next time, cheers.
You know Henry VIII?
Yeah.
Henry VIII. Well, he came on the throne, but what he did, the dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, and he made all these monks redundant, and they had to leave their monasteries in England, and already the art of distillation was known to them, so they had nowhere to go, and that's why they came into Scotland. First thing, if I ever see you holding a glass like this and nosing like this, I'll kill you. In this sample room, I've had 3 women, and within half an hour, they were dead.